Well, it's absolutely fantastic to have with me the Honourable Tom Kenyon, who's the National Chairman of Family First, just to talk about the rebirth of the Family First political party. Tom is a former Minister for Manufacturing, Innovation, Trade and Small Business. He's also had higher education and training as part of his ministerial portfolios in the Weatherall Labor government in South Australia. Tom, great to have you with us today.
Thanks, Lyle. It's great to be here.
So, Tom, very interesting that you're a former minister with having held high office in the South Australian government. I'm someone who's been involved in the Conservative side of politics, been a candidate with the National Party up in Queensland. We probably couldn't get polar opposites, but here we find ourselves in a new values-based party. How does that happen?
It happens because our values are more important than our party allegiances, and I think that's an important point to remember, and I think that's becoming increasingly important. Whereas, largely you could say throughout Australia's, political history, that especially in the last 50 years, you'd say largely that the conservative side of politics was conservative in all areas, so economics and legislatively and social policy, all of those sorts of things. And the Labor side of politics was largely the opposite of that. Less conservative socially and less conservative economically. Now, over time, especially over the last 20 to 30 years since the fall of the Berlin Wall, basically, that has changed quite radically. So it's got to the point where you just because someone's in the Liberal Party or National Party, there's no guarantee they're a social conservative, and just because someone's in the Labor Party doesn't mean there's any guarantee they're a social liberal. And what that's meant is you've seen this slow deterioration in social policy legislation over the last. It's really accelerated in the last 10 years in particular, and you've seen some truly atrocious bills go through all our parliaments, state and federal, and our habit of voting along party lines has allowed that to happen. And so now it's time to break that down, and that's why we've ended up in the same party, I'd say.
It is fascinating. So just a bit more about your background then. So how did you come to Labor politics then, Tom? Obviously, as a fairly young man, you served 12 years in the parliament. What drew you to the Labor side, particularly as someone who is a strong social conservative?
Well, at the time, there was a very strong tradition. So I joined in 1991, but I'd been really interested in politics since I was about 10, so 1980, 82, somewhere around there. And Hawke and Keating, remember, got elected in 83, and from then on, and I was paying attention from then on, from about 11, and really interested I really love politics. And so the work that they did, I mean, they were transformative of the country, but they did it in a way, like they really changed the economics, but they did it in a way where there was that safety net. There was Medicare, and there was the Accords, and there was eventually superannuation, all of these things that made the lives of working class people better, even as they changed the economy, sometimes to the detriment of those same people. So that was really what attracted me to the Labor Party. And, I was a big Keating fan, big Hawke fan. And so when I was at university, that's when I signed up in the Labor Party, and worked for a long time, campaigns and everything else before getting elected.
Yeah. Now you're someone of faith, and you presumably came through that Catholic right element of the South Australian Labor Party, which is quite famous. It's produced a lot of really fine parliamentarians, both state and federal. How formative was that group within the Labor Party for you as a young man cutting your political teeth?
Yeah, absolutely. It was very formative, very influential. And when that's, previously, to your earlier question just before, I was able to join the Labor Party because I was from this strong tradition of, Catholic right-wingers who joined the Labor Party, especially those who didn't join the DLP in that sort of, the 50s and 60s. But I stayed in the Labor Party, and those people were influential in my career. Don Farrell in the state Labor Party here in South Australia, now a senator. But
now a minister in the Albanese government.
Correct. Yeah, exactly right. Yeah. So that being part of that tradition meant I fitted in easily into the Labor Party.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And up until fairly recently, someone like yourself who has a strong pro-life, pro-family ethic, that fitted well into the Labor Party. What's changed, do you think, over recent years that have caused someone like yourself then to go, looking to a minor party to express your political concerns?
Well, I think over time, people like me, just left, either lost their seat or retired or whatever it was. And we didn't, if there's a failure on our part, it's that we didn't bring people along in our tradition to join in behind us, follow along behind us. And, and now critical error on our part. But, and so you basically, strongly pro-life people. There are pro-life people who are sort of quiet about it or not active on it. But for people like me who are strong on it, and that's a big part of why I was in Parliament, you sort of isolate a little bit. But I think that's increasingly true of both major parties now, is that if that's important to you and you're of that mind, like you and I, then I think you are a little bit isolated in those big parties. You've seen it in Victoria with Bernie Finn now, and just basically being booted from the Libs simply for being pro-life,
Well, that's right. There's nowhere in both sides, at Libs or Labor now, for people who are outspoken on those values. Tom, you, as I said earlier, spent 12 years in Parliament, had a very successful ministerial career. You sadly lost your seat when Stephen Marshall's government came to power just over 4 years ago. And it was sort of the middle of last year that you and another former Labor minister, Jack Snelling, got together and decided to do something. What was going on that caused you to both re-engage in politics and rebirth Family First effectively?
Well, it was really spurred on by in February last year, 2021, the state parliament in South Australia passed a bill that allowed abortion up to birth, and joining a lot of other states for that matter. So I think New South Wales, Victoria, Queensland all have bills like that now, and that we actually ran quite a good campaign. I was involved in the pro-life campaign in the lead up to that bill being voted on, and we ran a genuinely good campaign. The pro-life movement was the most united it's been in South Australia for a very long time. We had, I was working side by side with Pentecostals and other Protestant denominations, and that was not an issue at any point. There was that unity of denominations and unity of purpose, unity of messaging. It was really quite effective. We know that we were getting letters to the MPs at a rate of sort of 20 to 1 against. We had 5,000 people turn up in the rain to protest the bill, and a week later in perfect protesting weather, they could only get 150 in support. And yet the Parliament ignored all of that. And I've seen them fold for much lesser response rates, and yet they didn't. They felt, for some reason, they felt they could ignore all of that and still vote for the bill. And so we got thinking, why? What was it that gave them the confidence to do that, regardless of public outcry? And we realised it was because that vote was being taken for granted. That because in the case of Family First in South Australia, they had always preferenced the Libs no matter what. I mentioned abortion and opposed abortion in my maiden speech in Parliament when I got elected, and I was leading a lot of these votes against, well, a lot of the no campaign on internally in the Parliament when these votes and bills came up, and I could never get preferences from Family First because they were doing a deal with the Libs upper house for lower house on preferences, and we just came to the conclusion, because the Libs believed their vote was locked in. They didn't have to listen. Like, no one, the Labor Party never tried to get that vote, and the Liberal Party just took it for granted. And so we had to show that Christian vote could be moved from the Liberal Party or to the Labor Party, depending on voting record. And that's what we did. So we reformed, and we saw that Family First was a great vehicle to do that.
And for a lot of viewers who perhaps aren't aware of the history, and I should have mentioned this earlier, but Family First has had a hiatus of a few years. It merged in about 2016 or 17 with Coronati's Australian Conservatives. And then, of course, that necessitated the need to be reformed, which is what you guys did. And so you stood, Tom, as a lead candidate for the upper house and came very, very close. But as you say, you were able to shape the outcome in certain seats because you didn't just do predictable preference deals as perhaps Family First Mark I may have done from time to time. Just tell our audience about that strategy and what was achieved in spite of the disappointment of you not getting elected.
Yeah, so what we set down to do when we set out to put this party back together, Jack and I were both of the view, and later other people that we talked to and worked with early on, that the priority had to be shaping the parliament. And because when a social legislation comes up, it's almost always a conscience vote, which means the 47 people in the lower house in South Australia and the 22 in the upper house in South Australia are important, the quality of those people, and not which party they came from. So we needed to change the quality of the people, change the people in parliament. And so the priority was to change the parliament, not to get someone elected. And that gave us a lot of freedom about where to put our preferences. And so what we did was during that debate on the abortion to birth bill, there was an amendment moved by Liberal Minister David Spears, who was an excellent defender of life. He's now leader of the opposition in South Australia. He moved an amendment that would have prevented abortion up to birth after 23 weeks. And we used the voting record of MPs on that amendment. If they voted for that amendment, then we would preference them. If they voted against that amendment, then we would preference against them. And it didn't matter what party they were from. We just allocated preferences accordingly. And that had a big effect. There was also Family Party. Bob Day formed a party called the Family Party, and the One Nation Party were following the same principle in their preference allocation. So it meant there were three parties in a lot of seats that were preferencing to or from the sitting candidate based on their voting record. And it was tremendously effective. And particularly effective, we think, in 2 seats in King in the northeastern suburbs, but also probably Gibson in the western suburbs of Adelaide.
You copped a bit of criticism for that strategy. Some people said that, well, 2 former Labor ministers in yourself and Jack, that the new Family First was some sort of front for the Labor Party. I've had people say that to me since I joined now. You've explained very clearly, I think, why that's not the case. But just address that criticism, because it is a rumour that's being put out there, particularly by, I think, some who perhaps might be our enemies or want to do mischief to Family First.
Yeah, well, I mean, you can understand why people might come up with that criticism. I mean, because for the first time, the Family First was preferencing people in Labor Party candidates away from Liberal Party candidates. But my argument to them was, we're trying to change the Parliament. The people that we have in there, where we're preferencing against them, are basically no good. We don't lose anything by getting rid of them. And if we get people who are of the same opinion, well, so be it, because they don't have a voting record yet. We'll try and give them a voting record, and in 4 years, if it's no good, we'll preference against them as well. The whole point is to show that vote is mobile, because if we do the same thing and just preference the Libs over the Labor Party, we'll keep getting the same results. That's the definition of insanity. You do the same thing, get the same results, and expect it to be different. It's never going to happen. So you have to be prepared to take uncomfortable action to change the Parliament, and that's what we were trying to do. Now, the proof of the pudding will be that we consistently maintain this line on voting record over a period of time and a number of elections. And if we do that, well, then we're not Labor stooges. And if we just keep preferencing the Labor Party regardless of voting record, then we are Labor stooges. But we're not going to do that. We're not going to do that.
It's easily rebuttal. As you say, you've very positively influenced the outcome of the South Australian Parliament, even to the point where they have put in place a very conservative, or a more conservative leader in David Spears. So that's a terrific outcome, which may not have happened had not Family First have been active in this election. Well,
it definitely wouldn't happen, because Marshall may have won. Stephen Marshall, the Liberal Premier at the time, may have still won. And the fact of the matter is, even though he's not a lot more conservative, Peter Malinauskas is actually more conservative than the former Liberal leader was, the Premier.
Yeah.
It's not. I mean, Peter Malinauskas from the Labor Party voted for the Spears Amendment to prevent abortion to birth. Stephen Marshall from the Liberal Party and Premier voted against against that Spears Amendment and voted in favour of abortion to birth. So, tell me how the Liberal Party is better, and people can't. It's just that it's so burned into them that it's hard to make that step, and I accept that. Right, but that step has to be made. You have to vote and
Yeah.
preference people according to their voting record, not which party they're from.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think there's a big wake-up call that's slowly starting to occur amongst a lot of Christian people of other faiths, people who are just social conservatives, and realising that the Liberal Party very much has let us in. I mean, we saw Scott Morrison himself, supposedly, well, he is a Pentecostal Christian, but putting out letters where he endorsed abortion to birth and signed the bottom of it. So I think, these sort of things have shocked a lot of people to realise the Libs are like this. And I guess this goes to the next point, that this is the why of a family first. People are concerned that there's a lot of micro parties out there. There's a lot of fracturing on the centre right, but there's a need for strong minor parties developing. And I guess it's going to take a while for the dust to settle. How do you sort of address that concern about the fragmentation and give people a sense of the why Family First is the vehicle on this side of politics for people to get behind?
Sure. Well, I think the answer to the fragmentation is slow consolidation. I think it's sort of the nature of the right that we're a little bit more individualistic. We're a little bit more prepared to, well, I don't like this, so I'll go and do my own. That's that's sort of a trait of the right, really. And what that means is, over time, we have lost to the left because they are disciplined, and they will air their differences, they'll argue out their differences, but they make a decision and lock in. And that means over time they are defeating us, right? We are losing. And we need to do the same thing. We need to, discuss our differences, but in the end, lock in behind a situation and exert some discipline instead of believing ourselves to be wiser than everybody else and going off and doing it. And that discipline to put an idea above your own personal ambition or your own personal thought about how things should work is what makes political parties and groups successful over time. And so I think that the first step is for these parties, such as One Nation and UAP and others, the freedom parties that you see around the place, is for us to preference each other ahead of anyone else as a group. And if we can start to do that, we'll start to win seats and start to have a lot more influence. Why I think Family First is the best of those groups is because I think, to be honest, we've got a broader philosophy behind us. It's in many ways because of that. We get a lot of attacks because we're not a Christian party, but we are a party of Christians, and there's this a view that that's a damaging thing. I don't think it is. I think it gives us a philosophical base to explain why we do what we do and why we say what we say and why we believe what we believe. And so those sort of Judeo-Christian principles over time will allow us to be coherent in our policy and to start to attract people together and to start to give people an idea to organise around. I mean, the most powerful thing in politics is an organising idea, something that the Labor Party has had it with benefiting the working class for over 100 years. The Liberal Party has had it, since Menzies, with this idea of the forgotten people and looking after small business and everything else, small government. Now, I think there's an internal struggle inside just this big philosophical debate inside the Liberal Party, but it's also one going on in the Labor Party at the same time. And often those things are brought about by the existence of minor parties. So, the Labor Party has been dragged to the left by the Greens over time. And now, because, it's almost like the absence of a strong centre-right minor parties has allowed the left. It means that the Liberal Party hasn't been anchored and has been dragged to the left as well. So, we can play a really important role in the body politic by being that anchor that holds the Liberal Party just, right of centre or slightly right of centre.
And it hopefully even drags the Labor Party a bit more back to the centre as well. The whole
correct, that's right. But, and that's why being prepared to preference the Labor Party in the appropriate people at the appropriate time is important.
Well, Tom, I know that when I saw the news in the middle of last year that Family First was reforming, and as someone who'd been involved in the Australian Conservatives movement that was now defunct. And look, I think we've all been disappointed at the chopping and changing, but it's great to see Family First back. It's great to see people of your and Jack's calibre, as well as others who were involved 20 years ago in Family First, get the band back together in one sense. And I know that your view is we're here for the long term, and I'm really delighted to be a part of it. And I really hope everyone who's watching this broadcast and who watches the podcast gets a sense of the excitement and the possibilities that lay ahead for us. We're off to Victoria next, Victorian election, and then slowly reforming right around the nation. So looking forward to getting everyone involved and getting back together and getting this movement really strong again. So I just encourage people to go to familyfirstparty.org.au and you can become a supporter there, sign up, receive our material. But Tom Kenyon, National Chairman of Family First Australia, thank you so much for being with us today.
Well, thank you, Lyle. And if you live in Victoria, join while you're on the website, join the party. We could really use your help in the membership.
Yeah, important messages.
Thanks, everyone.
Membership, great stuff. Thanks, Tom.
Appreciate it.